Good afternoon and welcome to the University of KwaZulu-Natal Teaching and Learning TV. Teaching and Learning TV is a new concept that has just been piloted at this year's 8th Annual Teaching and Learning Conference. The aim of this concept is to promote public discourse on higher education. We've been really pleased to have a number of international speakers, prolific writers on higher education, people who are well known for their work. And today we want to have a discussion with Professor Renuka Vithal, who's the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Teaching and Learning at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, to pick up some of the themes, the major themes that have come up in the discussions over the week. But firstly, perhaps, Professor Vithal, you would want to maybe tell us a little bit about the genesis of this conference. I'm sure you're enormously proud that it's the 8th year that it's running, and maybe you could share some of that.
So the conference was initially a sort of internal UKZN workshop on teaching and learning, where a small number of academics, by small I mean like about 50 or so, would come together over a day or two and share practices and ideas about teaching.
And how long ago was this?
This was when I first was appointed to the position of DVC Teaching and Learning in 2008. Then in 2009, we thought that there are in fact very few conferences on teaching and learning in universities, in higher education. So we took the work that had been started as a workshop and began to make it into a proper conference.
Right.
So it first really developed as an internal conference. And because we were funding academics to do research in all different aspects of teaching and learning, we had just initiated a grant. It became an appropriate forum in which they could then present their work. Right. So there was a sort of a natural or an organic growth of ideas. And so as the conference, so the 2009 and 2010, each year the conference grew in size. We started calling for papers, not just to come and do presentations. And then we started developing a proceedings, you know, and so, yeah, and forming a proper conference. Okay. So, and then it was largely an internal conference, mainly just UKZN academics attending. But the word soon spread, and we had interest from academics from other institutions. So, and then it just grew in that way. And now we receive on average, you know, more than 200 abstracts, and about 150 papers get presented. In the last 3 to 4 years, that's what has happened. We've had about 150 papers, and we've had a growing number of delegates coming from other universities in the country, and also now increasingly from outside. So it's become one of the few higher education conferences where academics really talk about all different aspects of higher education, including teaching and learning.
Well, the word on the ground is that the conference is inspirational. I mean, these are the kinds of things you hear. It inspires people to go and do more research, but also inspires those who've never researched before in this field. So I've met quite a few people who've come just to listen to the papers and then say, oh, okay, that's what teaching and learning research is about, and I can do things like this and be self-reflective. But also I think that the conference is generating so much important discussions that need to happen in the current context. And we were having a discussion earlier that somehow the metaphor that Gayatri Spivak used in her opening keynote on the slow cooking of the soul has become a metaphor that has somehow found its way into the discussions at the rest of the sessions of the conference. Perhaps you want to comment a little bit about that?
I think it really does resonate. In fact, I also made a note of it, and she, you know, she kept on coming back to this theme about how the soul has to be trained slowly.
Yes.
So I think it goes to me, it reflects both the depth at which learning has to happen. It has to be your soul, and the time it takes for real learning to happen. There is this notion of deep learning. I think it's another way of saying it, but I think it's a very interesting reference to soul, because it does, in some ways, education is about the soul.
Yes.
even though we sort of, no matter that we couch it in maybe more superficial terms like outcomes and objectives and all these, but in the end, real learning is something that happens much more deeply. And I think how that happens, I think it does typically happen slowly, that you change over time, but it also does happen just like that. So if you have just somebody says something, or you just happen to interact or be sitting in a particular lecture or classroom. So I think it's a very, very nice metaphor that you can work with.
But that must pose a dilemma for you in a position of leadership in a higher education institute, where sometimes things have to happen quickly, and so you have to meet the numbers, you have to have the quantitative outcomes, and in essence, though Spivak and the others are really talking about, as you said, the deeper learning that has to occur. How does one balance this?
Well, I think the approach we've taken is to have multiple ways to reach academics and to inspire them and to think about their teaching. That's really what I think that just telling academics what they must do, I don't think that can ever work. So the idea is how to invite academics into thinking. So certainly one way has been through inviting them to undertake some kind of inquiry or research into their teaching and learning, any aspect of it, whatever interests them. And by being interested in that and thinking about what's going on here, they get invited into reading about it and so on. So that's the one route. I think the other route is we have invited academics to come to seminars and like to come to the conference. So that also kind of creates just a space in which you can go and listen, test out some ideas, think about it, and that also, when you're going back to your classroom, those things impact you. A third is we're very pleased that we have been able to implement this university education induction program. So in some ways what we're saying to academics is, as academics, you have a PhD in your discipline area. Yes, you do not always have the educational training. Here's an opportunity to acquire some of that. And what we've tried to, even though it's a mandatory program, the way we've tried to introduce it is to offer it in a way that directly relates to their practice. So if you go to a module on assessment, you should be working on some aspects of assessment of your own module. So that it's not a chore, but you're sitting together with other colleagues, not necessarily from your discipline, which is also that one of the ways in which we deliberately chose to have it in a sort of a multidisciplinary way. And the feedback we're getting from that is, even though sometimes academics come a little bit grudgingly to the program, in the course of it, they start thinking about it and so on. So we have more than 800 academics who have already attended at least one module. So if we take collectively, we have more than 300 academics doing one or other kind of research. That's just from the funding we offer. And if you think about, we have more than 150 papers, and at least 2/3 of it is from our academics within the university in every conference, which means that in the last 3-4 years, we've had 400 or 500 papers presented. So it's a very slowly, it has kind of seeped into the thinking and the discussions and so on. And what I'm beginning to see is that has changed the kind of discussions people have. Because they ask more challenging and searching questions. When you say, my students are X or Y, then immediately the question, how do you know that? And so it brings a kind of a scholarly discussion to the table about that.
And evidence-based, of course. So in a way, what's happening through this conference is that you are intellectualizing teaching. Whereas teaching could be considered to be very instrumental sometimes, and I think that's the way in which it's been positioned for a long time. So it's outcomes based, what's the objectives, etc. But this is forcing people to be self-reflective and to explore new ways of doing things. But this in itself is a political exercise too, as we know. I mean, if you think about things like curriculum reform, yes, it's part of a discussion, but that's also highly politicized sometimes. And I'm thinking of Sarojini's presentation where he used that lovely proverb, and again, the cooking metaphor seems to be coming out often, but the food cooked in foreign pots doesn't kill hunger. So sometimes it's, so I'm thinking here about language, the language policy, for example, and how that fits into the creativity, because you need to meet political aims, you need to meet teaching and learning aims, you need to meet research aims, and some comments about that.
So certainly the language issue, we have a university policy and we're implementing the policy. To me, the language issue really presented an opportunity to think about how we could influence curriculum reforms across the university. Certainly, I suppose one critique one could make. School curricula have been reformed nationally. You know, we've had far too many reforms actually. But it's interesting that even though academics enjoy full autonomy and freedom to change their curricula, it's remarkably resistant to change.
Right.
So if we look at curricula,
so self-change.
Yes.
Right.
So I mean, it's quite it's an observation you can make that if you look what is taught in mathematics now and what has been in first year, let's say, and 10 years ago, very little has changed.
Really?
Yes. And I think that's true for a lot of curricula in the university, especially undergraduate curricula, I would say.
Oh, okay.
That curricula are, university curricula have not significantly changed over time.
So it's a double bind then. So on the one hand, you have people who are not changing the curriculum themselves, even though, as you said, they have autonomy to do so. But on the other hand, there's resistance to change curricula when it comes from the top too.
So the language, the language issue presents an opportunity to open a discussion about changing curricula in a number of ways. So certainly we've implemented that students should learn an African language as part of the undergraduate curriculum. Is a major change across the university, because even if you're doing a BCom or a BSc, you're now having to do language.
Yes.
You know, a little course on isiZulu, for example. But increasingly, what the other element that has also slowly brought about change is the notion of asking questions about African scholarship.
Right.
So how are our curricula responding to African scholarship?
Right.
We've incorporated that, for example, when people develop programs or are reviewing the programs, to say one of the questions you need to address as you're designing a new curriculum is how do you embed an African scholarship? And I think one of the theme that we had on language, which was linking it to indigenous knowledge systems, offers an opportunity to think about that. So how do we integrate indigenous knowledge in whatever way it can be into our curricula, and what does that mean? And we could ask that both for undergraduate and postgraduate. So I think that, and we now have modules that are being offered in isiZulu. We have research being taking place in isiZulu. I think slowly also programs that incorporate indigenous knowledge systems are bringing in language, using the language in which the indigenous knowledge resides as part of learning the knowledge.
Yes.
So there's a natural fit, like an almost obvious fit there.
Yes.
That we should be doing.
But it's something that Sarojini was saying this morning is missing in the literature on indigenous knowledge systems, and particularly in development discourse as well. So the language of development discourse is itself foreign, as he said. That's interesting, though. Where do you think the resistance comes from? Is it just a political resistance, or is it something to do with people and how they understand curriculum?
I think, look, a curriculum is always a contested space.
Right.
So, and curricula are deeply held entities to to academics.
Yeah.
It's really sometimes what their identity and who they are and their work is embedded in curriculum.
Yes,
so when
Bill
you
was saying this is my life's work.
Yes,
That's how people describe the curriculum.
So the minute you start talking about somebody's curriculum, it's almost like you're going into their house. And telling them how they should arrange their furniture or something like that.
Right.
So I think if you appreciate that, then changing curricula is also a slow cooking process.
Yes.
Because you first have to think about why it needs to be changed. Then comes the questions about how it should be changed. And change to what?
Yes.
And to what end?
Yeah.
And it's quite important because it has, curricula have real consequences in the kinds of learning students take away. So if students are taking your course or your module or your program, and they don't think they're learning, or they don't think they're learning what is relevant, that's also then becomes something that becomes part of that discussion of what our curricula, and are we preparing our students for the world of tomorrow.
Yeah, but fundamental to curriculum reform is a willingness to be interdisciplinary to a large extent. If you think about asking people to embed African scholarship within their curricula, certainly they're going to have to borrow things that might not be intrinsic to the discipline. Actually, it may be intrinsic, but they've just never seen it. But it does allow, it means your borders have to be porous, right?
Yes.
And maybe that's, but do you think enough discussion has happened on what African scholarship is, really?
No, I do. I think we're only at the beginning of that discussion. So I think we now have a policy on IKS, and we'll need to move into a process of implementing the policy. I do think, though, that people are interested. I don't know that sort of resistance is resistance. I think, of course, initially when you just propose it, people don't quite know what it means, and you know, change is always something people are scared of. But when you engage, what about this, or what about that? Have you thought of that? And I do think that bringing indigenous knowledge systems into the curriculum, or even broadly, just asking the question about relevance, and asking questions about its appropriateness for a time that we do not know, then that opens for questions. So it opens for bigger questions about, if I take maths, let's take maths and science. For example, our curricula, our undergraduate curricula, do not necessarily give students an opportunity to ask questions, deeper questions about the philosophy and ethics of mathematics or science, for example. So that, whether you could call that disciplinary border crossing or taking a discipline and expanding it, you know, to say, should not undergraduates who major in mathematics know something about the history, philosophy, sociology of mathematics? Because it does exist now. You know, there are writings in that. And how does that enrich them and enrich the discipline? So I think there can be that kind of opening, or in fact border crossing. So then indigenous knowledge becomes part of a broader discussion.
Yes. But it's not just about the scholarship that's being produced, but it's also about the scholars who produce that knowledge. And so Retu, for example, has written, one of our keynote speakers has written extensively about black women, or the absence thereof in the academy. And this again is something that we need to talk about. What does it mean to not just produce scholarship, but who should be producing that scholarship, and where are they? So it's not just about who is there, but who is not there equally so. And you've had some experiences with this, and perhaps you may want to discuss this a little bit.
I think that is a real concern, and I think it's just quite topical at the moment about the underrepresentation of African scholars in the academy, and in particular women. So of course there is the underrepresentation of women, but I think in our case always intersecting race and gender is important.
It's very important, absolutely.
And I think there's several different explanations. So I would say in the first instance, African students, especially top performing African students, are not invited into the academy to the same extent as other students are. And I have really got to this understanding since I chair the scholarships committee and have opportunity to engage with like our cum laude and summa cum laude African students. And I often ask them when we're interviewing them for scholarships, has anyone asked you to stay in the university and become an academic? And I can't ever remember a case where students said to me, yes, Professor so-and-so did. So I just don't think that's happening enough. So that's the one. So the pipeline isn't coming in. So the students obviously leave and they go wherever they are
into
recruited.
The corporate sector.
Yeah. I mean, we are going to now address that because we are going to have a special scholarship for those students. Then I think once they come into the academy, it's the kind of support and guidance and direction African academics get. So I think because they are underrepresented in the institution, they often get put onto a lot of committees and they get put into a lot of work that compromises their time and ability to then focus on the thing that counts.
And Rachel in her book calls this donkey's work.
Yes.
Right.
And I think, and that just comes from good guidance. So having somebody who takes you under their wing and gives you advice and support and so on, I think is also key. And I would say my own progression through the academy happened because, and in my case, I had some professors from outside the country who gave that kind of guidance. I don't think it happens to the extent we would like to see it happen in the South African context. And I can say that in my comparison of my own experience of being in a university in South Africa and being in universities abroad. So I think that's another, having somebody root for you, look after you, give you guidance academically to make good decisions. And then of course, one of the things we've also picked up in the analysis we did of the academic promotions is that African academics participation rates, by which we meant the extent to which they would even apply for promotion, was the lowest of all groups. So that means it was half actually of any other group, which means they do not even put themselves up. And I think, and that's also true for women. Their success rates are higher compared to men, whereas men are more likely to apply even if they don't think they meet the criteria. Whereas women are less likely to do that, and African academics are even less likely to do that. So if you don't get somebody who supports you and says, let me have a look at your CV and see whether you meet the criteria, you don't think you are eligible or you'll make it.
But certainly that has something to do with social-cultural socialization as well, which perhaps is policy can never truly embody because policies are by their nature policies. But how do you take that and make it into a living document? I remember when I applied for promotion, the late Steve DeGlucci was then head of school. When I first showed him and he said, this is far too modest. There's no place for modesty. And I said, my culture doesn't allow it. You can't blow your own horn. But it's about embedding and understanding somehow within policy as well, the social-cultural impact and socialization that people have when they apply. But just as a last comment, perhaps, Professor Vithal, your hope for the future for higher education at this institution or nationally, internationally, what is your vision?
I think one of the wonderful things about my job as DVC for Teaching and Learning is I get to interact with academics across the board, and I also get to interact with students. And I'm very much excited and inspired by the students that we are having. The ones that I interact and the questions they ask and the challenges they pose to us. I know that sometimes we can get consumed with the issues of the enormous challenges students have around funding and so on, and of course the protests we have and so on. So I'm not discounting that's part of the challenge of universities, but I equally am so privileged to interact with students who think deeply about their education, who ask challenging questions, who care about the future. And that makes me enormously hopeful.
Okay, great.
So if ever I feel down about anything, just finding a group of students to talk to can uplift you, because it's the world they're shaping. And I think that maybe sometimes we don't always sufficiently acknowledge and even understand that.
Right, right. So you believe the students are the future? So
they are, and I think they're the reason that that inspires me to do the work I do and to think about what we're doing in supporting them and so on.
Great. Thank you so much for your time. I think it's been a wonderful 8th conference. And I think we have to acknowledge your role in that and in initiating this initiative. So thank you so much. And I really hope that it will grow from strength to strength. So thank you very much.
Thank you.